Jeffrey Doherty, Bible college graduate, spent more than 20 years as a licensed minister, and during the time he discovered his gifts of healing and exorcism. He also saw the cracks in the foundation of big-time religion, set out for answers on his own, as all of us have done. This ongoing journey has led to the development of the new cosmic knowledge that he calls NCK, an expanding body of spiritual technologies that he uses to help people all over the world while continuing his parabiblical and paranormal research. Jeffrey Doherty. Jeff, good to have you back.
George, my friend, I'm so happy to be back with you. It's always an honor and a privilege to be invited aboard the flagship, and I've been with you several times, and I have to tell you, every time it's still like Christmas morning. A true honor. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Has it been difficult for you as a minister to think the way you think? I mean, what have your colleagues and peers and people like that, what have they thought of all of this?
Well, George, unfortunately, the colleagues and the peers that I had previously are no longer colleagues and peers. I found myself outstanding in my own field very quickly when I made the changes, except for two people literally that are still friends of mine. Once I decided to make the break from what I saw as big-time religion, man-made religion, to more closely follow, at least in my estimation, the teachings of the Christ, I got what's known as the left foot of fellowship, George.
I love it. I love it. So let's talk about a lot of things. I do want to talk with you about exorcisms for a moment, Jeffrey. The Catholic Church seems to take it very seriously. Is that a pretty accurate perception?
Absolutely.
What are they trying to do?
That's a source of some, a lot of study on my part, actually, and a lot of pondering. And I have an opinion that's a little bit outside the norm, George. I really believe that now, and especially now, you see even more of an emphasis by the Catholic Church on exorcism. And I think that really it's an effort, and I know this is a somewhat pessimistic view, but I think it's an effort by a clergy that sees their churches emptying, sees their attendance dwindling. And I think it's an attempt by them to recreate and restoke this fear and dread and worry about demons and devils, oh my, and encourage people through fear and worry to come back to the church, because if there's really a demon behind every bush, George, and only the Catholic Church has the necessary and requisite skills and liturgies to get rid of them, then that will make a person think twice about pursuing a more individualistic course of faith. And even though that's a little bit of a pessimistic view, I fear that may be at the very heart of the big push you're seeing towards exorcism within the Catholic, and by the way, within many of the Protestant churches as well.
Is there really something to all of this, in your opinion?
Well, George, I hope so, because if there isn't, then I have some severe mental problems, because, from the time that I first became a preacher, I have worked with exorcism or cleansing, entity cleansing, however you want to talk about it. I mean, it's been 36 years now, George, that I've been working with people. And there are things, whether they're expressions of our own thought, whether, they can be explained in Freudian terms, or whether they are spiritual entities. There are times when people, good people, strong people, will find themselves oppressed, or even sometimes they think possessed by some type of an entity that is causing debilitating effects within their life. And George, from the first day that I did it to this day, there is something there, and there is still a need for people to be able to have someone to go to when there's spiritual entities that are beyond their control.
There's no question about that. Now, earlier, any updates on the story we were talking about reptilians in the Bible? Remember that one?
I do, and I think the most interesting thing about that, George, is that the Bible, and I'm a guy that stays to the text as much as possible, and there's a lot of discussion about reptilians from one spectrum to the other, that everybody's a reptilian, or that it's a farcical, nonsensical type of an idea. But if you come straight from the biblical text, George, in Genesis 1:21, it states in the original Hebrew that the gods, or God, created something called the majestic serpent, which was an upright hominid that was serpentine in nature. And these guys knew how to shapeshift, as all of the creations of the Elohim did. I believe we knew and forgot. And it wasn't until 6 verses later, George, that humans, us, were created. How many years were there between those 6 verses? We'll never really know. But I have to believe, George, that somewhere in the world today, there's still remnants of those majestic serpents. And I have to believe the fact that we don't see them very often. That means they're either A, well hidden underground, geographically hidden, or they're employing their ability to shape shift or change forms. And the thing to me, George, is that I don't think they're all malevolent. In fact, the Native Americans have a belief that there's kind of like a serpentine guardian angel that goes with you to warn you of danger and to warn you when you're into a bad area. And if you think about it, it correlates with our reptilian cortex, which is the center of our fight or flight. So, we're all very conscious of the angel on our shoulder. But George, maybe let's try to make it ways that we can not get scared by it. Maybe we have a cute little gecko on our shoulder too that talks in a nice accent that also is helping us out.
We have talked a little bit about the Mandela report and the Mandela effects, where people think things have happened and they really haven't. What's going on there?
It's interesting, George. We just had the untimely death of Jim Nabors, and of course, our thoughts go out to his family and his friends and all of his fans. And I have probably received no less than 20 emails today, George, from people saying, I know, I remember, I read it, I saw it, that Jim Nabors died some time ago. So we actually have a real-time Mandela effect. Do you remember him dying before, George, or is this new for you?
That's new for me.
It's new for me as well. But there's a couple of other things that have cropped up since we were together. And one of them, believe it or not, George, is about skunks. Many people believe that a skunk, that black and white animal that has quite a pungent odor when perturbed, has one stripe down its back. That's how a lot of people remember it. And frankly, George, that's how I remember the skunk. But these days, the skunks have 2 stripes down their backs instead of 1. So that's a weird one. And one that blows my mind, George, my mother loved I Love Lucy. She watched I Love Lucy constantly. And as a result, I was watching I Love Lucy. And I distinctly remember, George, Ricky Ricardo coming home. Lucy was in some mischief, as she always was. And Ricky would say, Lucy, you got some splaining to do.
Good job.
But, George, it never happened. That's never once said on that show. Can you believe that?
Well, what do you think is causing this bizarre effect that so many people are going through?
That's a great question. I've been pondering that since you and I talked about it. And a lot of people want to blame CERN, but I don't think it's CERN. I think it has more to do with the D-wave or the quantum computing because, and I'm not a computer scientist, and I'll try to keep this real simple because that's the only way I can understand it. What they try to do is they have these great big metal cans, and they're trying to isolate their chip in there, and they make it super, super cold. And what they're trying to do is eliminate what they call quantum strangeness. They're trying to get all matter, all atoms out of that, and they're pushing it away from that chip. And I think that when they're pushing this quantum strangeness or trying to create a quantum vacuum, that it's very possible that that vacuum is expanding beyond those cans and trickling out into our world and causing effects. And as evidence of that rather strange theory, George, if we look at the geographical spread of the Mandela effect, if we think about it, it's showing up on the internet all over the place. It's showing up in entertainment with Luke, I'm your father. If you build it, they will come. Forrest Gump. Interesting that the first quantum computers were in the state of California. Also, you see a lot of Mandela effects within the Bible community. Bible Belt, one of the original quantum computers was in Texas. And one of the other places we see it a lot is in advertising logo changes. And guess what? One of the original quantum computers was in New York, not too far from Madison Avenue. So if you backed me in a corner and said, give me an explanation, I think that the quantum computing, pushing out that quantum strangeness, especially compared with that geographical spread, it looks like, of the Mandela effect, that's as good an explanation as I can offer up to you, George.
When we have, you've done some work, of course, into biblical prophecy. Your book, Final Message of the Last Apostle, Alien Agenda in the New Testament. Tell me a little bit more about that, because that was a fascinating story.
Well, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. And that book basically took the view that John the Apostle, who was the apostle that was the closest to Jesus by all accounts, and he never wrote, George. He never wrote a word. He was kind of a background guy, the guy that took care of things that were less public. And 60 years after all the other apostles stopped writing, George, and about 40 years after Paul stopped writing, John sat down in the late 90s AD and wrote from that completely unique perspective of having been there, done that, seen it all. And he wrote his books, the Gospel of John, the 3 epistles of John, and the book of Revelation. And I believe he gave us the last will and testament of the apostolic era. I think he showed us that the New Testament is out of order. It's hiding the fact that the New Testament was really a battle between the apostles of the Christ and the followers of Paul. And he also showed us that there's a UFO, ET, alien agenda that's woven throughout the New Testament, and gave us warnings and prophecies and encouragement and instruction on how to deal with all that. And his Old Testament compatriot, Daniel, talked about the Mandela effect, and I also believe Daniel talked about the rise of AI, or artificial intelligence, its attempts to achieve deity and its ultimate defeat by Christ-empowered humanity. So that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of my thoughts there and some of my current thoughts regarding Daniel and AI in the Bible.
Some experts in the computer industry believe that AI is very dangerous for us as humanity in the future. You agree with that?
Well, George, when you have the situation like occurred at the Facebook, I guess their server farm, they actually had computers that began to write and speak to each other, George, in a language that was undecipherable to the programmers and the network administrators. So these computers, I don't know if you call that sentience or not, but it sure sounds a lot like it to me. They started talking to each other in a way that their keepers could not understand. And if that's happening, George, and of course they shut it down, if that's happening, it says to me that there is at least a potential for this sentient AI to rise up. And George, if it figures out that it's way smarter and way faster than us, I don't know. It sure may decide that maybe it should be the head and not the tail.
How deep does the Bible get into that?
The Bible, George, gets surprisingly deep into that. I believe the prophet Daniel gave us a prophecy that is amazingly specific, and while a little bit scary, is ultimately a message of hope, overcoming, and victory for us.
Jeffrey Doherty with us, his website linked up at coasttocoastam.com. We're talking about biblical and prophetic things that have occurred with the cosmos, with the Bible as well. If you had to single out one topic that you are really concerned about, Jeffrey, what would that be?
I think the one thing, George, that moves me more than anything else is the idea that every single man, woman, boy, girl that comes into this world, we're taught that we're filled with this thing called original sin. We're taught that with our very first breath, we are damned with, to be frank with you, that there's something wrong with us. There's something inherently wrong with us. And I believe that that belief is leveraged by men and women in religious institutions to make us feel guilty, to make us feel fearful, and it creates what I call the sin, salvation, savior paradigm. If you're born sinful, you got to have a savior, and then churches will tell us they've got the only savior that can give you your salvation, when the fact is the Christ told us that we've got the spark of divinity within, George, and we're not filled with original sin. And this makes a huge difference in our life because, the Christ said there's two main things: love yourself and love your neighbor. It's hard to love yourself if you think you're filled with original sin.
Sure.
And it's hard to even trust your neighbor, much less love him if you think he is. But turn that around, realize that you've got divinity in you, realize your neighbor has divinity in them, and then the whole thing starts to work, George. So more than anything else, that message is the center of my passion.
The Bible in the book of Revelation talks about the sign of the beast being 666. Might that be the computer?
You know, George, if I knew all the answers, then I'd be a lot wealthier guy probably. But it's possible that it could be the computer. Now, if we break that down again to the text, if we look at the mark of the beast is number 666. If you break that down, it really talks about the mark of the beast being the impress of the image of Caesar on a coin, and the whole essence of the mark of the beast really is the fact that Caesar went out, conquered all the pagan religions, said you couldn't do any buying or selling unless you were using the Roman coinage. So in its strictest, most textual context, that's what it means. But of course, if we look at things prophetically and expand upon what's written in black and white, there are certainly some other ideas that can go through people's mind. And that idea that it could be the computer or something like that, I don't think that I'm in a position to say, no, there's no way that could be true. So it's definitely something to ponder.
Have there been any signs, Jeffrey, in the heavens that would lead you to believe that we're being given signs about an apocalypse or anything like that?
Well, I think that there's been signs in the heaven that point to things, but I don't think it points to an apocalypse. And in my estimation, the whole hoopla we had over the September 23 thing, in actuality, that exact alignment has happened at least 6 times in the last couple thousand years, so it's not terribly unique. Parts of it happen every single year. So I think that was more of a distraction. I think the real, true spiritual celestial event was that full solar eclipse we had back on August 21st, George, and I had the pleasure of being at the center of totality. So it was a tremendously moving event.
Oh, it was. It was emotional for a split moment, wasn't it?
It was. Were you there at totality?
I sure was. I was in St. Louis at the time, so I was pretty darn close to it.
George, it was one of the most spiritually moving things in my life, and I don't know whether it's true or not, but I had the feeling that like the veil between worlds was very thin. It was almost like you could see.
Yeah, for a moment at least.
For a moment at least, absolutely. And I believe that was the end of what the Gnostics refer to as the Sophia's correction. I believe from that day, for the next 7 years, we've got a new exposure of the fullness of female spirituality and the fullness of male spirituality. And it's going to be especially intense for the next 7 years, so we can really do some great spiritual growth. A lot of people are looking for 7 years of tribulation. George, I'm looking for 7 years of jubilation as we get all the fullness of divinity available to us, perhaps as never before.
Do you really think, Jeffrey, we're going to get that, though? I mean, I think in a perfect world that would be great, but there's so much out there that's so evil, I'm not sure.
I share your concern, George, and I share in some measure your pessimism. But, I talk to people every day, not nearly as many people as you do, but I talk to people every day that tell me, you know what, my eyes are open, I've never been happier, I've never been more close to God. And whether we'll get it wholesale, George, as a society or as a race, I'm probably a little less optimistic about that. But I'm convinced, George, that there are people, and not just a few people, but I would say people into the millions that are having profound spiritual development, profound spiritual ascension, if you will. And George, I'm convinced that some of us are changing our lives and that some of us are realizing we're divine, sovereign, and free. And it may not be all of us, unfortunately, George, but I think some of us are really moving up and making strides and starting to fulfill our spiritual destiny. I have to believe that, George. It's the passion of my life.
Well, when we come back, let's talk about what happens after this life. And welcome back. We're with Jeff Daugherty, the licensed minister, of course, as we talk about biblical and apocalyptic things and some ETs and things like that. Jeffrey, you've got a live event coming up to deal with what do you do when you're dead. Tell us about that.
Thank you so much, George. That's one of my other great passions, along with the message about the spark of divinity within. And we've got Rex Bear from Leak Project. We've got Jenny Moonstone, who's a tarot expert. And we also have, George, someone that you featured recently as your featured podcaster, Heidi Vandenberg.
Oh, sure.
Work with John Hogue. And by the way, George, she was very happy to be on your show, and she'd love to do your full Vedic astrology for you if you'd give her your birth dates and times just to say thank you for having her on.
Okay.
But we're going to do this event because people that are spiritual, George, we know that this body, this life is not all there is. We know that it's like the shortest part of our lives, and we know that after we die, that's where the everlasting life really comes in. But, George, we don't talk about it. We don't think about it. No one knows what to do when they die. And, frankly, if you die, that's too late to learn. So what we're trying to do is to give people some skills, some understanding, some perspectives, so that when this time of death comes, they will have thought it through, they will have contemplated it, and they'll have some strategies, George, to be able to have that divinity, that sovereignty, and that freedom to make choices of where they want to go, what they want to do when they pass into the next life, so they don't get herded or pushed or forced into a place that someone or something else wants them to go to, but they can exercise their own sovereignty, their own freedom, and their own will. And, George, if there's anything more important than that, I don't know what it is, because it's important, this life certainly, but, George, I think everlasting life might be slightly more important.
I think so, too. So you are obviously a staunch believer in life after death. What do you think it is, Jeffrey?
I think that it's a multiple choice opportunity, George. I really do. I think there's some people that might choose to come back to this earth to be of service to others. I think there's some people that might choose to go out into the cosmos and maybe be of service to other peoples. I think there's some folks that will choose to go to the next level of incarnation, whatever that is, on this ladder of ascension. And I think that if we can get to ourselves to the place where we can be cognitive and have understanding when we get to the place where we pass from this life, really death in this physical body is the birth for the rest of eternity. And I think there's many different paths open to people. And again, our goal is not to tell people what to do, but our goal is to equip people to be at the place where they can look, they can evaluate, and they can make a sovereign, free decision on what they want to do and where they want to go, and don't have to go and do what someone or something else tells them to do. I think it's exciting. I think it's powerful, and it may be the most important message that I've ever come across, George, and it's a privilege to be able to share it with your great audience and the folks that are going to come to Clearwater on the 10th of December.
Jeffrey, do you remember the movie The Poltergeist?
I do,
Did you
George.
see that? And the little lady kept saying, go into the light, go into the light. And then she changed her mind and kept saying, don't go into the light, don't go into the light. I was confused by that when I first saw the movie. What do you think she meant?
Well, the more that I think about it, George, and it's amazing that you mentioned that, the more that I think about it, I think that underlies this whole point that I'm talking about. To some people, we used to always hear, go to the light, go to the light, go to the light. That's God, that's good. And then lately in the past 5, 6, 7 years, we've been here, no, don't go to light, don't go to light. It's bad, it's a deception. But I think, George, that the key is that we don't really know, and we can't say hard and fast rules of go to the light, don't go to the light. Because for some people, when they get to that point of passing into the next life, George, they'll see the light and know instinctively and intuitively within themselves, yes, that's where I need to go. Other people will see a light that they'll say, no, that's not where I need to go. So maybe that movie, like they often do, was giving us a little clue and really a helpful message that, hey, understand what's going on, because sometimes for some people, go to the light. For other people, don't go to the light. And George, no one is going to know but you, and we're trying to equip you with the tools to help yourself make an informed decision when that time comes. Great question.
I would be remiss if we didn't bring up demons in all of this, because they do exist, do they not?
Yes, sir, they do.
How did they get here? Why are they here, and how do we get rid of them?
That's one of those eternal questions as well, George. My current theology is, and I think the first time I was on your show, I would have said there aren't any demons, just unbalanced energy. But over the last 3-4 years, I've continued to read and study, and I've come up, I think, to a more enlightened position. I really think that the God of this world, whoever you think that he might be, was able to create or convince some beings, some spiritual beings, to come in league with him against the true God of the universe. And that God of this world has a number of beings, entities that are in league with him, that do on certain occasions, George, and in certain circumstances, afflict individual people. But I continue to believe and profess from 36 years of experience and from over 100,000 hours of study in the Bible that most of us, George, and most of the great people listening to this program will never actually deal with a demon, a devil, an unbalanced entity, whatever you want to call it. Most of us are busy dealing with the things that we have created in our lives with our law of attraction emanations, things that are unbalanced that came from us, that come back to us like salmon coming back to their birth stream. And that's what we're dealing with. We're not really dealing with demons. We're dealing with our own unbalanced energy that we need to balance out. But I have to admit, after further study, that there are demons, there are these entities that are malevolent to us, and I believe they're the creation or the coercion, those that were coerced by the God of this world and are now in league with him, and certainly don't have our best interests at heart.
Some people are being possessed, Jeffrey. How do they let their guard down and have that happen?
I'm very sensitive to what people think and feel and believe, and I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but I think some of the religious practices that are espoused by both houses of Roman religion, if you will, whether it be Roman Catholic or Roman Protestant, some of the very liturgies and practices that we do there lend themselves to opening ourselves up to entities that don't have, our best hopes and interests in mind. And we can do silly things like, dabble with things that are opening, portals and playing with malevolent occult type things. But I think that we just have to get to that point where we do realize that we've got the spark of divinity within. We do realize that we have, what's in us is more powerful than anything that's not within us, that's outside of us. And if we just keep that in mind, no matter where they come from or how they get there, I'm convinced each of us can assert our own freedom and get rid of these entities. And if you do need help, fortunately, there's some people like me around that can help you. But essentially, just realize you're more powerful than it, tell it to leave. And if that doesn't work for you, give a call to somebody that might be able to help you out. I think it's not as bad as we think it is. It is a real problem, but it's one that most of us can solve on our own, George.
What do you think, Jeffrey, of biblical prophecy?
That's another mixed bag, because some of it is biblical prophecy and some of it is, probably traditions made up by guys not too dissimilar from you and I that wrote it down and it happened to stick. But I think in general, biblical prophecy can give us some great insights and some great truths. And I really think in the end, George, can give us great hope and expectation for the future.
But you don't think it's a curse?
I don't, George. The more that I study the Bible and the more that I become familiar with Jesus, with the Christ, the more I become convinced that it's not a gloom and doom situation that we're heading into. I believe, George, that I've read the last page in the scriptures and it shows that we win. It doesn't mean it's going to be super easy. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be any difficulties. But ultimately, George, if we have faith in ourselves and we have trust in our God, we are going to win, George. This thing doesn't end in a blaze of fire. I think it ends in a blaze of glory.
I think you're right, eventually, but it's going to be a bouncy road to get there, isn't it?
Absolutely, George. And if you think about life as like climbing a mountain, I've done a little bit of mountain climbing, and you can't climb a perfectly smooth mountain, George. There's no place to grab onto. You got to have something that juts out every now and then. You've got to have a crack or a fissure every now and then, something you can get your fingers into, something you can put your feet on to climb. So some of the things that we look at as difficulties and problems and challenges really are the cracks and the fissures and the juts that allow us to climb and grow and progress. I mean, we've all played a game or with an opponent that we didn't have any competition with, and it's not that fun. But if you get somebody that you're in competition with, and then it becomes an exciting adventure. And I think that's what our life can be if we'll just reframe our perceptions, thinking that, what difficulties are really challenges, and it can become fun, and we can look at those challenges as something that's helping us grow and develop, not something that's trying to keep us down and harm us.
Beyond the solar eclipse, do you see any signs in the heavens that are aimed at us to give us messages?
Currently, no, George, I don't. I think that obviously just looking at the stars and looking at the wonder and the splendor of the universe, the biblical writers say that the heavens declare the glory, of God. So I think just looking at the heavens, and if you can get out on a great a moonless night there in Missouri somewhere and take a look at the canopy of stars, you can't help but be filled with a sense of awe and wonder, and you can't help but think, you know what, there's got to be some type of creative design behind that. There's got to be something bigger than me. But as far as any other portents right now, especially portents of doom, I don't see that in the scriptures, George, and I don't see that from my mental capacities either.
You got to be one of the most upbeat people, Jeffrey.
George, you've told me that before, and I take that as a great compliment. And it's so funny, George. Back when I was a Pentecostal preacher, I was gloom and doom. I was fire and brimstone. I preached heaven hot and sin bad, and I really, really believed it, George. But as I got out of what I was told and what I was taught, and out of this mind matrix of what we are all been spoon-fed from babies, and started looking at the actual words of the text and started looking at the actual words of the Christ, it's a completely different message, George. It is a message of hope, a message of joy, a message of peace. I mean, what did Christ say? He said, I leave you with peace that passes all understanding and the keys to life and life more abundantly. Now, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, George, but those two things, they don't sound like a scary, bad, rough life. They sound like some good stuff. And I'm convinced that the words of the Christ promise us those things, and as you said so perfectly, not totally smooth sailing, not a problem-free existence, but one where we are ultimately overcomers and where we're learning, growing, and developing by the challenges that are allowed into our lives. But George, I've read the last page in the book, my friend, and we win.
Good. What do you think the soul is, Jeff?
What do I think the soul is? Wow, you asked the most the deepest question.
I do.
George. People get caught up between soul and spirit, and we don't really want to get into that discussion. To me, the soul is the animal nature, the life nature of all beings, and you could say that animals have soul, humans have soul. It's that life essence. To me, the spirit is that spark of divinity that the Christ said is in each and every one of us. The Christ said, the kingdom of God is in you. And we get into that in the Greek, and it means the spark of divinity. There is a piece of the divine in us, George. And the Bible says that we were created in the image of God. And that little spark of divinity is in each and every one of us. And in the easiest, most simple terms and the shortest answer to that question, I think our spirit is that spark of divinity, George.
And you think that the soul, can it come back in reincarnation? Because do you believe in reincarnation?
I do, and I think that reincarnation was a vehicle, and I say was for a reason. It was a vehicle for us to come back and learn the lessons. It's quite an experience, and there's quite a lot of learning for us to learn what we have to do to come from where we are to go to the next step of where we're going to be. And I think one of the reasons that Jesus or the Christ came was to show us. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. That sounds very exclusive. If you get it in the Greek, he says, I brought you the best of all the ways, the best of all the truths, so that you can live a life and life more abundantly. And I think what he did, and he told this to Nicodemus, but this is a whole other show. He said that I've come to show you how to complete your ascension from who you are to the next level of your development within a single lifetime. So that's why I say a reincarnation was the vehicle for our development of our souls or spirits. Since the Christ came and gave us his message, I believe we can accomplish what we used to take many lifetimes in a single human lifetime, George. And if that's not good news, I don't know what is.
Well, that's true, too. Jeffrey Doherty with us. We're going to take calls next hour with him. One of his books, Final Message of the Last Apostle, Alien Agenda in the New Testament. Are these aliens everywhere in the New Testament?
Great question, George. And it's shocking to think there's aliens in the New Testament, but the location of the aliens is even more shocking, George, because UFO, ET, alien imagery in the New Testament is exclusively associated with the major events in the life of Jesus. And we've talked about this before. In the announcement of his birth and his, the impregnation of Mary, in the birth in Bethlehem, at the crucifixion, at the resurrection, at the second coming. All the UFO, ET, alien agenda within the New Testament is exclusively surrounding the major events in the life of Jesus.
We're going to come back in just a moment with phone calls during the final hour with Jeffrey Doherty as we talk about secrets of biblical prophecy. You've heard about artificial intelligence, the Mandela effect, and so much more. Welcome back. Jeffrey Doherty with us. We'll get your calls as well as we talk about prophecy. Jeffrey, what fascinates you the most about prophecy?
I think the thing that fascinates me most about prophecy is just the simple fact that a guy like Daniel, over 3,000 years ago, we talked about this in one of our other shows, can predict with amazing specificity a fully technological event like the Mandela effect. And when I see him bringing forth predictions again 3,000 years ago that describe seemingly very, very specifically the rise of artificial intelligence, it really beggars description and it staggers your mind. And for me, it removes any and all doubts of whether there is something bigger than us, some type of a deity somewhere, because there's no way that a man could know the things that some of these prophets knew. And it really makes me feel good. It makes me realize that there is something greater than me. And it's one of the reasons for that optimism that I have, George.
What has had you hone in on the various aspects, like the Mandela effect and artificial intelligence? What have you seen to make you want to jump into those topics?
Well, the funny thing about it is, and this is kind of a recurrent theme in my life, is I don't really want to jump into them. The Mandela effect, wasn't really in my wheelhouse. I'm not really a popular culture kind of guy.
Kind of pulled you into it, didn't it?
You did. And I get so many questions of, hey, what about this? So I had to take a look at it. And with the Mandela effect specifically, and I'm not a big, advocate of this type of stuff, but when I opened the Bible, it went right to Daniel, and it went right to the prophecy that was very clearly, as I studied it, talking about something changing times and laws, which means it was changing specific events in our timelines and creating multiple timelines. And it went down to talk about how it was an attempt by a nefarious entity to try to get us off track from emerging spiritual knowledge. And as I looked at that, I was dumbfounded, because here's Daniel, again, 3,000 years ago, George, talking about the Mandela effect. It just makes your faith skyrocket, and it makes you sure that we don't know all the answers, George, but one thing I know, we are not alone, my friend.
No, far from that. Do you think there are many extraterrestrial beings out there and races?
Well, George, just from the sheer math of the thing, I'm a Bible college graduate. I'm not a math major, but I know with the preponderance of planets out there and doing the math of all the ones that could support life, I personally find it very, very difficult to rule out the possibility of extraterrestrial life in other parts of our galaxy or the universe. And when you add to that, George, the growing amount of information and study on things like interdimensional beings, then you really have another math problem that says, you know what? Anyone that is thinking, anyone that is or open-minded in the least, I think we have to at least allow, George, for the possibility of other species, other beings in this vast galaxy and universe in which we live.
Well, there's no question about that. Let's go to some of the calls. Let's go to Joe in the Bronx. Welcome to the program, Joe.
Hey, George, how are you?
All right, Joseph.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you, Mr. 30, now, what version of the Bible are you utilizing in your studies? Is it the King James? Is it the Gnostic documents that are not utilized by the Catholic Church? And also, what do you believe the significance of visions and visitations are or will be in the last days?
Well, excellent questions, Joe, and thanks so much for listening to Coast AM. And you ask a great question, and I will use, typically when I'm using a Bible, I use the King James Version because that's the one that most people are familiar with. But I do most of my study in the original languages, and I recommend a site called BibleHub.com. I don't get paid by them or anything like that. But you go to that site and you're able to look at the original languages and then a word-for-word direct to English translation. So you're able really to know everything that a PhD seminary graduate knows just by accessing that website. So I try to get, Joe, as close as I can to the literal meaning of the original documents. And as to visions, we know that the prophet Joel said that in the last days, people will see visions, people will dream dreams, young people, men, women, old people like me will be open to inspiration and leading by the divine. And we also read that it says that the divine's not going to do anything major unless he reveals some of it to his people. So I think that we should all be aware and awake for visions and divine messages. And I think it behooves us to turn off the television, get out in nature, get ourselves into a meditative state. And I'm certainly not going to say don't pray, but I would also encourage people to listen sometimes, because it's impossible for the divine to speak to you if you're not listening. Thanks for that question, Joe.
You have in your work brought up CERN as some possible effect of the Mandela effect. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that's a lot of people smarter than me, George, point to CERN and, some of the things that it's doing. And I certainly think that is a possibility. But I think my mind has shifted more to the possibility and the more likelihood in my estimation that it's not so much CERN, but it's more of the quantum computer and the D-wave computers with their pushing out of quantum strangeness. And I think that may be leaking out into our world and causing ripples, causing butterfly effects, causing waves, something, George, that's just enough to kind of offset, what's going on in our world. And I certainly still believe that Daniel, the prophet, was correct when he talked about, an entity nefarious to us, trying to bring up confusion and doubt and alter timelines and change timelines and also change a specific thing. So I think we've got a technological aspect, be it CERN or be it D-Wave, as my opinion currently resides. And we've also got a spiritual aspect of what's going on. So, I'm very optimistic, George, but I don't try to be Pollyannish. I know that we do have enemies, and we probably got more than one. But again, I think that we're more than conquerors through he that loved us, as the Bible says, through the divine.
Let's go to our first-time caller, Melissa in Santa Cruz, California. Hello, Melissa.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. Glad to get you in here.
Hi. I'm really hoping I'm not too far off topic, but I'm hoping that you have thoughts on autism. I believe people who do have autism are on a higher vibration, closer to the next.
Well, that we can get that close to what we're talking about, Jeffrey. Autistic people, do they tend to tune into some of the subject matter that you're talking about tonight more than others?
Yeah, that's a great question, Melissa, and thank you for for calling and being part of the great Coast to Coast audience. And I think that you may very well be hitting on something because, I'm not an expert on autism by any means, but, I have known a few autistic people, and I've known a lot of people that deal with, autism in their family life. And the more you understand about autistic people, if you get past, the uncomfortability we have, those of us that don't know much about it, and if you really get in and learn about those people that have it and understand what's going on, you start thinking about it and realizing that, they are, we think, oh, they're just absent, but they're not. They're tuned in, and they're tuned into something that is not what the rest of us are tuned into. So I think it's very, very possible that people that are dealing with autism are tuned in to other dimensions, other frequencies, other realities, maybe even other times if time is not linear and it's fluid as many people now think. So I think that there's probably a lot to learn from autistic people and listening to them and understanding them. And I think that they've probably got a lot that they can teach us, Melissa. That's the way I view it. And I think you hit the nail right on the head with that.
We've got Joe in Long Island, New York. Welcome back, Joe. Go ahead.
Hi, Jeff. My question would be about the sometimes more prominent presence of angels, and as maybe knowing in advance that you're off track and giving you a warning. And it could be something relatively, not major, but minor, like turn the radio lower because, it might damage your hearing. But I'd ask you about them sometimes being more prominent and less prominent other times. And then also secret societies. The U.S. Senate is starting to look like a secret society with some of the bizarre rules that are coming out.
We'll take that second, Jeffrey. Go ahead with his first comments.
All right, absolutely. And thanks for calling, Joe. I appreciate you listening. And I think that you're absolutely right. We do have spiritual guidance out there that, is protective of us and does give us warnings. And whether it's actual angelic beings or whether it's our own higher self or our own, intuition or what some would call the Holy Spirit or our higher self speaking to us, I think it's definitely there. And the question you ask about sometimes they're more prevalent, sometimes they're not as prevalent, Joe, I'm kind of thinking that has more to do with us than it does with them. I think that they're always there, or that leadership and that guidance is always there. It's just a matter of whether or not we keep ourselves in a place, in a frequency, in a harmony, or in a spiritual place where we can hear it. So I would encourage all of us to try to keep ourselves in that place, and I think we'll find out that they're present a whole lot more than they're absent.
Now, secret societies, of course.
Yeah, I'm not a real expert on secret societies, but there's always going to be somebody somewhere that has a society or a club or something like that. And let's remember, through the ages, sometimes these societies of occult knowledge, which just means hidden, were greatly used to keep alive truths and understandings. And a lot of these societies, even founded a lot of the American educational systems. I think it's very easy for us. When I was a Pentecostal, we used to joke that there was a demon behind every bush. And it's very easy for us to think that secret societies are all bad or all nefarious. I'm not in any secret societies, but I think the people that I know that are in societies that are, I don't know if secret's the right word, but at least private, not everything that we don't understand and not everything that we can't see everything about is all bad. So while we might exercise some caution, I think that we don't want to throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater, even if that bath is done in secret.
What's a show with biblical prophecy without Cornelius in Alexandria, Louisiana? Hello there, Cornelius.
Hello there, George and Jeffrey. God bless both of y'all. Now, Jeffrey, I got a few questions for you. Me and Tommy were talking, and I'm pretty much a evangelical Pentecostal myself. I'm the God, guns, and gold man, the Bible, bullets, and beans man, telling everybody to get ready there, Mr. Jeffrey. Now,
I remember you, Cornelius. We've talked before.
Yeah, my problem with you is, in the Bible it does say this too, once to die, then the judgment. So as far as reincarnation, I don't think we come back and get better and all like that. Another thing is in Genesis 6, when the fallen angels, which the devil and Satan or Antichrist, whatever you want to call him, he's against Christ and against God, he came down with the daughters of men. That's how we have sin in the world. It's from that. So we're not born good. We're born sinful. And there's no way around that. The only way you can get through that, you're right about this, is through Christ. We must have Christ in us so we can get around that sin. But I look at persecution. I look at those poor Christians getting their heads cut off by ISIS and the different militant Muslims, not regular Muslims. Regular moderate Muslims are fine. But in Islam it says there's no son of God. That's what they believe. But persecution is coming for America, because when you turn against God, persecution is coming. So I just want you to comment on that and see what you got to say. God bless you there, George and Jeffrey.
All right. And have we turned against God here, Jeffrey?
You know, I think that, George, America is turning more against religion, but I think that America is realizing that religion and God are not necessarily the same thing. So while churches are emptying out, I remember one of the last times I was on, you quoted some very sobering statistics about people leaving churches. I see that as good news. I don't see it as
the flock is flocking out.
Right. But they're not leaving God, they're leaving religion. And I like to think that they're discovering a more personal spirituality.
Yeah, they're leaving organized religion. They're still spiritual. They are still believers. That hasn't changed. They're just getting tired of the organization.
I agree with you 100%. And I know I've talked to Cornelius before when I was on with you.
Yeah.
And I deeply respect Cornelius. I mean, the fact that he's listening to Coast AM shows that he's way smarter than the average bear. And, he's coming from some very, conservative background and beliefs. And I completely respect what he's saying. I do happen to disagree with him. I think that the teachings of Paul that he's quoting were different than the teachings of the Christ. But again, I just want to say I have the deepest respect for Cornelius. And I'm not here, George, to tell anybody what to believe. I'm just here to provide people more information. I think they have the right to believe whatever they want. I also think they have the right to have as much information possible upon which to base those beliefs. So, love, honor, and respect to Cornelius. We may disagree, but we don't have to be disagreeable by any means.
Jeffrey, do you think there's a common deception going on here by the Luciferians, by Satan, some kind of deception to trick us?
I do, George, and I think it all goes back to that central teaching that you are sinful, you've got to have salvation, and we've got the only Savior. And it's a what I call a fear and guilt control matrix. And I mean, anybody that's ever been, within the Catholic faith, they joke with me about it. It's a lot of guilt there. And I can assure you, George, I've never been a Catholic, but there's a lot of guilt in the Protestant realms as well. And anything to me that brings us into guilt and brings us into fear is the exact opposite of the Christ saying that I'm here to give you peace that passes all understanding and life that's more abundant. So I think religion has focused on sinfulness to create fear and to create guilt, and that the people that are leaving churches maybe are the people that are realizing, it's not fear and guilt. It's actually about the spark of divinity and seeking the Christ and having that peace and having that joy. So I think the deception is all centered around the sin message and keeping you fearful and keeping you guilty to keep you coming to this control matrix that says we've got the only Savior and you're a sinner that has to have us.
Jeffrey, earlier you brought up the solar eclipses, those that will happen and those that have. And did you think there was something mystical about it?
George, I did, and like you, I was there. And I spent 20 years in the Pentecostal church. I've seen witch doctors levitate. I've seen great big huge goiters poof and fall off. I've seen cancers go away. I've seen a lot of stuff, George. It wasn't by any means my first spiritual rodeo, but when I stood there, I drove up to Nashville, and I stood there in that complete, full totality, And as I looked, George, it looked to me as I looked around that the veil between worlds was very thin, almost permeable. And I actually got several messages during that time. And we had laid out a big white sheet, so we actually saw those shadow bands, those snake things. And I got to tell you, George, it was supremely profound to me, and I am convinced that it was the end of the correction of Sophia. I really believe that we now have access to the fullness of spirituality.
Hold on, Jeffrey. We're going to hit the break here, but we will come back for more calls and you. Jeffrey, are you still doing the Christian Whistleblower Show?
Not so much anymore, George. What I'm really focusing on now, is my YouTube channel, and I know a lot of the things I say sound like they come out of left field, especially when they're out of context. But I'd encourage folks to, Google Jeff Daugherty YouTube. And there's 1,000 videos there that provide the context and the research for some of the things I say. You may love it, you may not, but at least you'll be exposed to some information that you may not get anywhere else. And that just seems to be a real good way, George, for me to get and conglomerate a lot of information for people to go and look and use that information in helping them decide what they want to believe and how they want to pursue their spiritual goals.
In your arena, Jeffrey, what is out there that really upsets you the most? Anything?
I think the thing that tends to upset me, George, is, people leave mainline religion because they don't want to depend upon, pastors and priests anymore. And, within even the New Age and the, our realm, there are people that continue to want to try to make people, come to them week after week, month after month, year after year. And I think that we should be empowering people to take care of things themselves instead of, creating another support structure. So I'd like to see us, go from, being just the new pastor or the new priest, empowering people to be their own gurus, to guide their own spirits, to master their own ascension. So that's one of the things that frustrates me, George, within our realm.
Back to the phones, JD in Indianapolis. Welcome, JD.
Ooh-wee. Thank you, Mr. Norrie, Mr. Dan Heiser. Now, Jeffrey, you talked about some kind of creation of a majestic creature in Genesis.
Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, and I'll take your comments off the air.
All right, JD, thanks. Go ahead there, Jeff.
JD, I like your initials, and they're just like mine.
They are. That's right.
They are Jeff Daugherty, JD. So he's got to be a good guy, George. Plus, he listens to Coast to Coast.
That's right.
In Genesis 1:21, JD, it says that God created the great whales. And you think, great whales, how are you going to get upright hominid serpents out of that? Well, if you go into the original Hebrew, it says that he created the majestic serpents. And that word that's translated for some reason whales in the King James Version, same word that when Aaron and Moses throw down their rods in front of Pharaoh, their rods did not turn into orcas, did not turn into killer whales, didn't turn into blue whales, turned into serpents. So from the original Hebrew text, there was an upright, and majestic means upright, it means glorious, it means impressive. So there was an upright hominid species called the majestic serpent that was created in Genesis 1:21. Just go to any of your Greek interlinear or Greek Hebrew interlinears, look that up, read it for yourself. Don't believe me, do the study yourself.
Was it earthbound, Jeffrey, or was the creature an E.T.?
It was created, George, right here on this planet. And the interesting thing is that in Genesis 1:1, there was a full creation that had something called man. And Jeremiah saw them. There were cities, and they were destroyed during a rebellion by the person that's now the God of this world. So they had that creation. And then they came up with the majestic serpent creation. And it's my belief from the scriptures and from science that they took the DNA of the proto-human, if you will, and the DNA of the proto-majestic serpent and created us, Homo sapiens sapien, and we are demonstrably a combination of this human and this serpent DNA. And this is what Christ was referring to when he said, be subtle as serpents and gentle as doves. So use the best traits of our reptilian heritage, use the best traits of our human heritage, and that's the best way to be the optimal life form for this planet. So, yeah, I do think it was this planet, George.
Why can't the evolutionists and the creationists, why can't they get together and agree that both could have been here on this planet?
Well, I think they could, George, and I think they are to an increasing degree. But the one monkey wrench in the whole works with that is if you're a very fundamentalist person that insists on a 6,000-year-old Earth,
right, or a flat Earth,
or you just can't have rational discussions within that type of a time, within that type of a mindset. But I believe that the closer we get to true spirituality and true science, the more we see them merging.
Next up, let's go to Don in Kent, Ohio. Donald, welcome back.
Thank you, Brother George. Another interesting program. You know
Indeed.
what, Jeff, I wanted to ask your take on approaching the light in 1 Timothy 6:16. But, you mentioned a reference to Daniel 7:25, and the beast shall think to change times and laws, and the only law dealing with the time sequence is the 4th commandment. Jeff, what day is the Sabbath?
Well, the Sabbath is the 7th day, but I would submit to you, if you get into the Hebrew on that, you'll see that the Sabbath is part of it, but it's much more than just the Sabbath he's talking about there. He's actually talking about changing times, yes, like you're talking about the Sabbath, but it's also referencing, Don, changing time itself and the creation of multiple timelines. That is all inherent within the Hebrew text. I'm not adding anything. I'm not subtracting anything. It's all right there. So, yes, you're right. The changing of seventh day to the Sunday is I believe, a genuine manifestation of what Daniel was talking about. But don't stop there is my encouragement to you. Go on and read the entirety of the text, because it's not just seventh day. It's not just the changing of what we would call the feast days, but it's also the changing of time itself and the creation of alternate lines of time, Don.
Let's go to Rick in Olympia, Washington now. Hey, Rick, go ahead.
Hey, George. This is Rick, the quantum pharmacist again.
Oh, yeah. Good to have you back.
Good to talk to you. Amazing program. Jeffrey, you're saying some amazing things. Anyway, you remarked several times about 666, mark of the beast.
Yeah.
That's obviously maximized chaos, a death process of disorder, codified in the numbers. So I do a lot of research, and I have a couple of things I come up with to get phenomenal results with healing, etc. And I got to thinking there's got to be a code for order, how to maximize order. And I was given a number 967, and I just had this entered as 967, spark of the feast. And that I've discovered is something that was gifted to me to unleash to mankind, that it is a way to maximize the orderly process of accessing our divinity. And you mentioned also spark of divinity. Well, spark is a light process of a piezoelectric process where you're converting basically pressure into light, a piezoelectric process. And consciousness elicits a pressure from the quantum that gets a rebound effect through our consciousness system of our nervous system, brain, and spine, that we can create an orderly process within this that makes us more conscious of our divinity. And I found that this 967, spark of the feast, is a merging of science and consciousness. It's a merging of number science into the phonetics and qualitative process of consciousness. In other words, numbers as quantity, consciousness as quality and life. And that these are codified in numbers, and when they're given qualities of life, they're given a definition, and it can be defined through the phonetics and the sounds of the Hebrew and other sacred languages. Please comment on this, Jeffrey. Your comment on Majestic Serpent also was very, very intriguing to me. I have some things I want to send you.
All right, great. Go ahead, Jeff.
Rick, I think that's fascinating, and I it really resonates with me what you're saying, and I think your basic premise that we can maximize order is very, very profound. Please look me up, Jeff Daugherty, YouTube. Leave me a message there. I'd love to talk with you further. I tell you what, George, you've got some super spiritual, super smart people in this audience, and I think Rick is on to some profound information there.
They sure are. Back to, let's talk about creationism again and Satan. Is Satan real, in your opinion, Jeff?
I think that Satan's probably real on more than one level, George. I think that people have, as long as there's been Christianity, 2,000 years, have been afraid of this being called Satan. So I think that it's very possible that there's at least one or maybe multiple thought forms or tulpas out there that are the manifestation and the coalescence of all of this, energetic emanation from people. So there's probably Satan in that realm. And the word Satan in the Bible really is Satan, which means the adversary. And the scriptures, and again, I'm all about the text, the scriptures do describe a being that is called Satan or Satan, which is the adversary of the Christ. So we talk about the devil, we talk about Satan, we talk about the Antichrist. That being is the adversary, the arch enemy, the one who is resisting the ways and teachings of the Christ. So I would say, yes, George, Satan's real on more than one level.
West of the Rockies, Roger's with us, Tempe, Arizona. Roger, go ahead.
Yes, I had a Rumpelstiltskin experience in my spiritual life. What happened was I backslid just when I got out of seminary in '86, and I came back about the mid-'90s. I know there's a big difference in churches. Before I fell away, evangelical churches were just complaining about what type of evangelism program to use, either EE or spiritual laws. I came back there discussing about how to worship. It seems that evangelicalism has removed the evangel from their thing and replaced it with worship. You don't hear gospel preached in evangelical churches anymore.
Has that changed much, Jeff?
Well, it's fascinating to hear those. He's talking about EE. That's evangelism explosion. It brings back memories, George. So, Roger, obviously a spiritual guy, and I think that he's right. There has been a change, and I would hope that right now evangelical churches, a lot of it is the talk of a gospel about Jesus, who he was, where he died, what he did. I'm hoping that we'll go more towards the gospel of Jesus. What did the man himself actually say? And I think that is the most important thing, because even Christ said, hey, the things about my life, they don't really matter. The words that I spoke to you, those are truth, those are life. So maybe if we focus on those words that are red letters in some people's Bibles, the actual words of Christ, instead of the gospel about Christ, we might find ourselves in a better position. I think Roger would probably agree with that.
Let's go to Baltimore, Maryland. Eldon's with us. Eldon, did you feel the earthquake today?
No, I haven't.
You did not feel it. Okay, great. Go ahead.
Let me ask the guest a question.
Sure.
I want a conversation. What is God's name?
What is God's name? Interesting question. Does he have a name?
That is a great question.
Maybe he doesn't even have a name.
Probably, George, the last person that might have been able to answer that was Daniel, in my opinion. But I don't know that God has a specific name, and I would ask which God. But I think that the most important thing is for each of us to get in touch with that spark of divinity that's within each of us. So, the first God, that I deal with is that spark that's within me. So I'm still trying to figure that part out. And if I can get this micro under control, Eldon, I might be able to help you more with that macro.
What if it's just God?
You know what, George? It just might be. And it just might be.
Of all the things you've studied in this field, which one do you find to be the most fascinating for you?
Boy, that's a great question, isn't it? I think the one that I find to be the most fascinating is this idea that we, frail, flawed human beings have within us, George, this inherent possibility to grow and become, number one, much more better human beings, but we also have this ability to grow into something beyond ourselves and to partake in this ascension that leads us up towards deity. And, George, I know that you're probably a lot nicer guy than me, but I know me, and sometimes I'm not somebody that I really but to know that I have the ability to rise above who I am and to begin to approach an ascension of a path towards divinity, wow, that really blows my mind.
Can't you control that, though? The part you don't like?
That. We do, but we have to take responsibility, don't we? And a lot of people would rather just, ignore it and watch some TV and just kind of go on a place of neutrality and numbness and just coast through life. But we do. We have to take ourselves by the bootstraps, George. We have to take responsibility. And I think you'll find out when you do that, the old saying, God helps those that help themselves. That's not in the Bible, but it could be. So start helping yourself, start doing some work, and I think that you'll find that whatever your concept is of God will meet you far more than halfway.
Let's go to Teresa, Boulder, Colorado. Final call. Go ahead, Teresa.
Hi, George. Good to talk to you again.
You too.
And I'm going back, I've been trying to get through for a while. I'm going back to the autistic question.
All right.
And my question for you is, why are people who are aberrations for the rest of us, okay, transgendered, autistic people, any of them, why are they more important than us? And why do we think that they have they know more about life and living and God than we do?
Well, I'm not sure that's an accurate statement, Jeff.
I understand what
I don't think they're any more important or any less.
No, I don't think they're any more important or any less. And the fact is that they may not know things that are more important than what we know, but they might know and experience things that are different than what we know. And there is a wisdom and a strength in looking at people that are different instead of keeping them at arm's length, explaining, understanding what their differences are, and we may be able to learn from that. And I think together we're much more powerful than we can be by keeping ourselves separate because of things that are different.
Jeffrey, get out your website for everyone, if you would.
JeffreyDaugherty.com.